Can you actually think your way out of trauma? It's the 29th of June, 2026, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a massive, frankly fascinating debate in the world of psychology. Today, we're unpacking some core frameworks presented by a creator named Yasminn on her channel Just to See What Happens. We're tackling a big question. Can we actually talk, journal, and analyze our way out of our deepest trauma? Or does the physical body hold the real, undeniable answers? Let's dive into what we're calling the somatic architecture of identity.
Now, if you're anything like me, your first instinct might be to play devil's advocate here. I mean, we live in a society that absolutely champions the Western intellectual tradition, right? We swear by talk therapy, we fill up notebooks with endless journaling, we analyze our behaviors to death, and we kind of just assume that if we understand a problem deeply enough, boom, we're magically free of it. But Yasminn counters us with a pretty provocative thesis. She argues that the mind actually hits a hard wall when it comes to true healing.
Which brings us right to Section 1, the ceiling of the mind and our intellectual limits.
To really understand this limit, Yasminn shares a super relatable story about hitting this exact ceiling. Basically, she got triggered by something she genuinely thought she had already resolved through all her inner work. She knew exactly why it was happening, she knew the origin of the trigger, she could literally name every psychological dynamic at play. And yet, despite all this profound intellectual awareness, she still spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. So why? Well, because during an active physical trigger, rationalizing is pretty much entirely useless. Knowing the origin of your fear does absolutely nothing to stop the physical feeling in your chest. Your nervous system is basically running a totally different software program, and it speaks a completely different language than your intellect.
So, if the mind is sidelined, we arrive at Section 2, speaking the body's language and figuring out where trauma actually lives.
To grasp this, we really have to look at the neurobiology. It's a tale of two brains, essentially. On one side, you have the prefrontal cortex. That's the new brain. It uses words, it uses logic, it's rational. It's the part of the brain you're using right now to listen to me, or when you're writing in a journal. But trauma doesn't live there. Trauma and those really intense emotions, they live deep in the limbic system and the brainstem, the old brain. These structures evolved millions of years before language was even a thing. So they don't process words at all. They process pure sensation, impulse, contraction, and expansion. When something completely overwhelming happens to you, your brain makes this brilliant split-second calculation. It basically says, okay, I don't have the bandwidth to process this right now, I just need to survive. So instead of dealing with the emotional weight, the brain deliberately shoves that unprocessed trauma out of the active mind and files it away directly into the body. It literally pushes it into your muscles, into your breath patterns, into your tissues. It's absolute genius survival biology in the moment, but it leaves us lugging around all this deferred emotional baggage.
Let's explore exactly where this baggage goes in Section 3, fascia and emotional scars.
So, if the brain is treating the body like a giant filing cabinet for trauma, where exactly are the files kept? Yasminn points to some highly specific anatomical structures, and the first major one is the fascia. Now, you might be rigorously questioning this. How on earth can connective tissue hold an emotional memory? Well, fascia isn't just wrapping paper. It's a continuous, interconnected web wrapping around every single muscle, organ, and bone from your head to your toes. It's kind of like an inner skin, and the absolutely crucial part here, it is incredibly dense with nerve endings. In fact, researchers now consider the fascia to be one of the most important sensory organs in the entire human body.
So, here's how this emotional filing system actually works biologically. When you go through a deeply traumatic event, those nerve endings dump stress chemicals directly into the surrounding fascia. This creates what researchers call an emotional scar. And Yasminn argues this isn't just a metaphor. It's a literal physical structural imprint of your experience, encoded right into your tissue. It honestly perfectly explains those crazy stories you hear where someone is just getting a normal back massage, Enya's playing in the background, and suddenly they start sobbing uncontrollably without knowing why. Their body is literally just releasing the chemical memory of an old emotional scar.
This leads us right into Section 4, the psoas muscle connection.
Beyond the fascia, there's another really specific anatomical player here. It's arguably the most famous physical reservoir for deep, unresolved trauma, the psoas muscle. This is a very deep core muscle located in your hips, and it physically anchors your lower body to your spine. Yasminn explains that the psoas acts as this primary trauma sponge entirely because of its biological job. When you're terrified, when you perceive danger, this is the exact muscle that instinctively clenches and braces you for impact. It's literally the physical epicenter of your fight or flight response.
Because the psoas is the star player in our survival response, it holds on to that intense tension way after the actual threat has passed. It's such a compelling biological argument, isn't it? It perfectly highlights the frustrating limitations of sitting on a couch and just talking, versus the visceral, immediate reality of our physical memory banks. It explains exactly why someone doing deep hip-opening stretches can suddenly get hit with a tidal wave of grief, or unlock a memory that years of logical, cognitive therapy couldn't even touch. The mind forgot, but the body absolutely kept the receipt.
Which brings us to our final core concept today, Section 5, Healing Through Slow Movement.
All right, so we've identified the problem, and we know the anatomy. So what's the actual fix here? Yasminn proposes a fascinating synthesis to bridge this whole mind-body divide. If our trauma is physically trapped in the fascia and the psoas, then the release has to be physical too. We literally have to bypass our logical brain. And this brings up a massive realization about how we live today. Speed is actually a defense mechanism. Yasminn points out that our modern Western obsession with rushing around, multitasking, and constant productivity is just a way to maintain the illusion of control. The speed of the mind lets us literally outrun those deep, terrifying feelings waiting for us in our bodies. As long as we just keep moving fast, we simply don't have to feel.
To counter this, Yasminn introduces a very specific, actionable practice: painfully slow, intentional movement. And when I say slow, I mean uncomfortably slow, like moving around your living room like a literal sloth for 40 straight minutes. Now, it probably feels totally ridiculous at first, but by removing the momentum and the rush, you force your hyperactive mind to just give up control. And what happens next is a total involuntary surrender to the deep physical presence of the body.
Now, I have to warn you, trying this requires an incredible amount of psychological vulnerability. Because without your to-do list or your momentum to hide behind, you're forced to face whatever those tissues are holding onto. Yasminn actually shared this beautiful anecdote about trying this herself. She said after moving at this agonizingly glacial pace, she just started crying out of nowhere. These massive waves of pain, fear, but also compassion and love just organically bubbled up to the surface. It absolutely wasn't something she thought her way into. The body just naturally surfaced what it had been holding onto all those years.
And hey, if moving in slow motion isn't your thing, there are other somatic tools that bypass the analytical mind. During that panic attack we talked about earlier, Yasminn used deep breath work, EFT tapping on acupressure points, and even literal shaking and dancing. Now, I know dancing during a panic attack sounds a bit wild, but think about an animal out in the wild. Right after an animal survives a life or death chase, what does it do? It literally shakes its entire body to physically discharge all that excess survival adrenaline before it goes back to resting. Well, human beings have that exact same biological need to shake it off. She also points out that extremely slow, conscious, intentional touch can work wonders for communicating basic safety directly to an overwhelmed nervous system.
And this brings us to such a profound point of synthesis. Think about it. You can stand in front of a mirror and chant positive words of affirmation until you're blue in the face. You can pay a therapist a lot of money to sit there and assure you that you are perfectly safe. But if your physical body is tense, braced, and locked in survival mode, those words just hit a brick wall and slide right off. Cognitive work and verbal processing only actually work when the physical body has released its tension and physically feels safe enough to let them in. But once that body is finally open, those exact same words become incredible, transformative medicine.
Look, the intellect is amazing. It's incredibly valuable for reflecting and making sense of our crazy lives, but it's not the sole architect of our identity, and it has a ceiling. The body is where your actual lived experience resides. So, the question I want to leave you with today is simply this. If your body is genuinely keeping the score, literally filing away your emotional scars in your fascia and bracing your muscles against your deepest fears, are you finally ready to stop overthinking? Put the journal down, slow down, and actually listen to what your body is trying to say. Thank you so much for exploring this somatic framework with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
You know, it's funny, when we normally talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this very distinct, almost comforting expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they put you in a machine, and the x-ray produces this image with a jagged white line.
Right, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there is the problem.
Exactly. It's incredibly straightforward. There's no guessing.
Well, it is, mostly because we are inherently visual creatures. You know, we find immense comfort in things that can be categorized, isolated, and just pointed to on a screen. I mean, the biological hardware of a broken bone is undeniably visible.
But the moment you step outside of acute physical injury, like the second you step into the world of neurodevelopment or chronic tension or trauma, that X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah, completely obsolete.
We are suddenly forced to navigate a diagnostic landscape that isn't just murky, it's virtually invisible to traditional imaging.
Which is incredibly frustrating for a society that relies so heavily on empirical visual proof. If we can't see the structural damage on an MRI, our medical default is often to just assume the issue is purely psychological.
And it's all in your head.
Right. We aggressively separate the mind from the physical hardware.
And that assumption brings us exactly to the core of our exploration today. Because today is June 29, 2026, and we have curated a highly specific, deeply tailored deep dive just for you listening right now.
We are putting the traditional X-ray machine away today.
We really are. We're looking at something that evades standard imaging, but arguably dictates almost everything about how you experience your daily life.
We're looking at the physical architecture of your past.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore an exclusive core theme, which is the somatic architecture of identity. We're going to analyze this truly fascinating conceptual framework presented by a young lady named Yasminn on her YouTube channel titled Just to See What Happens.
Her central claim is one that completely upends how we traditionally view self-improvement. She states, very simply, that the answers are in the body.
Not in the intellect, not in, like, the latest self-help book, in the tissue itself. So today we have a laser focus on how specific physical structures, specifically the fascia and the psoas muscle, along with the practice of uncomfortably slow movement, act as a literal biological archive.
Yeah, they store, and crucially, they can release our emotional scars.
It creates this brilliant friction for us to debate today. We're essentially analyzing the fundamental tension between our modern culture's absolute worship of the intellect and the raw, unnegotiable biological reality of somatic memory.
I mean, we really do worship the intellect, don't we?
Oh, totally. I want to start right there, actually, because Yasminn's premise hits hard right out of the gate. She points out that we live in a society, and specifically a wellness culture, that essentially deifies the mind.
We operate under this collective, almost arrogant assumption that if we just analyze a problem deeply enough, we will be free of it.
Right. It is the defining premise of the cognitive era.
The prevailing wisdom is basically, if you can name it, you can tame it.
But let me push back on that, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener who has spent, years in therapy. You go to a professional, you talk about the difficult childhood or the bad breakup, you meticulously journal your feelings.
You do the work.
You do the work. You have these massive aha moments where you connect all the dots, you map out the entire psychological landscape of your issue, and you can proudly explain to your friends exactly why you have an anxious attachment style.
Intellectually, you have built a flawless cognitive map of your own neuroses.
Exactly. But Yasminn describes a phenomenon that almost everyone who has done this kind of extensive inner work eventually slams into like a brick wall. It's the phenomenon of the hijack.
Ah, the hijack. This is where the sheer frustration of the human experience just peaks.
It really does. She shares this very candid personal experience where she was triggered by something she truly, genuinely believed she had resolved. And on the surface, the situation wasn't even a massive deal. It was just a minor interpersonal conflict.
But her body reacted like she was standing in front of a firing squad.
Yes. Her chest constricted, her heart rate spiked into the danger zone, her breathing became shallow and rapid, and her thoughts just began spiraling completely out of her conscious control.
And here's the kicker, right? The part that makes this so maddening. She knew it wasn't rational.
Right. As her heart is pounding out of her chest, her highly evolved intellect is sitting there watching it happen, totally aware that she had already worked through this issue in therapy.
She understood the origin of the trigger.
Everything made perfect logical sense in her mind as she was analyzing the crisis in real time.
Yet that pristine cognitive knowledge did absolutely nothing to halt the physiological cascade.
It is wild to think about. You possess all the data, you have all the insight, but you are still a complete prisoner to the physiological response. It really makes me question the actual efficacy of our cognitive tools in these acute moments.
It really exposes their limits.
I mean, is trying to think your way out of a somatic trigger essentially like reading a swimming manual while you are actively drowning?
Oh, that analogy actually highlights the biological reality perfectly. When you are drowning, the part of your brain that comprehends the physics of buoyancy and the mechanics of a freestyle stroke is just entirely offline.
It's shut down.
Exactly. The disconnect happens because in the exact fraction of a second that a physical hijack initiates, your nervous system switches to a completely different software program. And it is a program that your thinking mind simply does not have the administrative rights to override.
I love that framing. Administrative rights. It's like the intellect is pounding on the glass of the control room, but the doors are securely locked from the inside.
The intellect has hit its ceiling. Yasminn notes that she felt like her nervous system was speaking a foreign language, and from a neurological standpoint, it literally is.
Because the answers she needed to calm down weren't accessible in the conceptual realm of thought.
No, they were buried down in the visceral bodily realm.
Okay, but if our intellect is so highly evolved-like, if it's the crowning achievement of human evolution that allowed us to build cities and split the atom, why is it completely locked out of the control room during a hijack? What is biologically preventing that access?
Well, to understand why the intellect is locked out, you have to look at the evolutionary timeline of the human brain. Yasminn breaks this down in a way that just strips away all the mystery.
So it's not a glitch, it's by design.
Precisely. Trauma and intense emotional responses do not live in the modern, sophisticated part of our brain.
So what part of the brain are we actually talking about then? Because usually when we talk about memory, we associate it with the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex.
Right, but the prefrontal cortex is the newest addition to our evolutionary hardware. It sits right behind your forehead.
The part that makes us human, basically?
Exactly. That is the region that uses words, logic, rationality, and narrative time. Past, present, future. But acute survival responses and the memory of life-threatening stress, they live in the much older lower brain, specifically the brain stem and the limbic system. These structures developed millions of years before early hominids ever uttered a single word.
Which means those specific brain regions literally lack the biological hardware to process vocabulary.
Yes. They do not speak English. They do not understand the sentence, "You are safe now."
Wow.
They communicate exclusively in the language of sensation, impulse, contraction, expansion, temperature. That is their entire operating system.
That is such a vital distinction, and it explains so much about the failure of traditional talk therapy in extreme cases.
It really does.
Because when we try to talk our way through a deeply traumatic somatic memory, we are using the prefrontal cortex. We're using language.
But the trauma itself is encoded in a region that doesn't understand language.
It's like trying to program a modern computer using a vintage typewriter. The inputs simply do not match the receiver.
What's fascinating here is the sheer ruthless efficiency of this biological triage system.
Yeah.
It's what Yasminn refers to as survival biology.
Okay, let me challenge this idea of brilliant efficiency for a second.
Go for it.
The concept of survival biology is that when an overwhelming event occurs, the brain calculates that it doesn't have the bandwidth to process the emotional horror of the moment while also trying to keep the organism alive.
Right, so it bypasses the processing center entirely.
But if evolution is so smart, why create a system that essentially stores unexploded psychological ordnance in the body, which ends up ruining our long-term health? I mean, that seems like a massive design flaw.
Well, it looks like a flaw from the perspective of a modern human trying to live happily to the age of 85.
Fair point.
But evolution doesn't care about your long-term emotional fulfillment, It cares about keeping you alive for the next 30 seconds.
Just get to tomorrow.
Exactly. When you are being chased by a predator or when you are in a catastrophic accident, stopping to emotionally process the terror would result in immediate death.
You'd freeze and get eaten.
Right. So the brain essentially dictates, I do not have the metabolic resources to digest this emotional weight right now. I just need to mobilize every ounce of energy into the legs to run.
Okay, I see the logic. The brain defers the processing to prioritize immediate survival. But the kinetic energy of that terror, the biochemical impact, it doesn't just evaporate into the ether once you survive the event. It has to go somewhere.
It has to. The mind cannot handle the burden in that moment, so the burden is distributed into the physical form. Yasminn uses a very apt metaphor here. She says the trauma gets filed away.
But where exactly is the filing cabinet? She claims it gets pushed down into the tissues, like it alters our breath patterns, it hides in a clenched jaw, or in chronically tight hips.
Yes.
But how literal is this? Are we talking about a metaphor for stress, or is there an actual biological storage mechanism?
It is not a metaphor. The triage prioritizes the immediate continuation of life over emotional digestion, and it pushes that undigested biochemical load into the physical structure. And that brings us to the primary filing cabinet Yasminn focuses on, which is the fascia.
Okay, here's where I need us to really dig into the mechanics, because the idea of somatic memory can quickly sound very mystical or new age if we aren't careful.
It can, but it's pure biology.
Right. Yasminn defines fascia as a continuous web of connective tissue. It wraps around every single muscle, every organ, every bone, and every nerve in the human body.
Just imagine it like a three-dimensional, uninterrupted matrix. From the top of your skull down to the soles of your feet, it is essentially an inner skin holding all your components together.
But she doesn't just call it structural wrapping. She highlights that it is one of the most important sensory organs we possess.
It is.
It is densely packed with nerve endings. So how exactly does an invisible, abstract emotion turn into a physical scar in this fascial web? Walk me through the actual biology of that translation.
Okay, let's look at the cellular level. When an organism experiences intense fear or trauma, the sympathetic nervous system triggers a massive release of stress chemicals, primarily cortisol and adrenaline.
The fight-or-flight juice.
Exactly. These chemicals flood the bloodstream, but they are also released directly from the nerve endings that are embedded entirely throughout the fascial web.
So the fascia is essentially taking a bath in high-octane stress hormones.
Yes, and the fascia is not just inert plastic wrap. It contains these cells called fibroblasts.
Fibroblasts.
Right. When these fibroblasts are bathed in stress chemicals and subjected to the mechanical tension of a body bracing for impact, they react. They begin laying down thicker, denser, less pliable collagen fibers.
Wait, so the chemical flood of the emotion actually changes the structural composition of the tissue?
Exactly. The tissue literally remodels itself to become armor. Researchers refer to this as an emotional scar.
That is unbelievable.
It is a localized area where the fascial matrix has thickened, dehydrated, and adhered to surrounding structures as a direct result of chronic or acute sympathetic nervous system activation.
That honestly blows my mind. The invisible emotion has a literal physical footprint.
It does.
I used to think of this like pouring hot wax over a rigid shape where the emotion just kind of cools and hardens. But based on what you're saying about fibroblasts, it's actually much more active than that.
Much more.
It's more like taking a soft, flexible woven net and throwing it into boiling water. The fibers actively shrink, they mat together, and they become permanently tangled unless they are intentionally mechanically stretched back out.
That is a much more accurate biological representation, yeah. The tissue fundamentally changes state. And this localized structural change raises a massive question about how we interact with our bodies, specifically regarding physical touch.
Right, because if our tissues are essentially a topographical map of unhealed, localized stress responses, physical touch suddenly becomes a minefield.
It explains a phenomenon that Yasminn points out, which many people find deeply confusing and somewhat embarrassing. Have you ever heard of someone receiving a massage, and when the therapist applies pressure to a specific, seemingly random area, like the neck or the lower back, the person suddenly bursts into tears?
Yes, uncontrollable crying. And if the therapist stops and asks what's wrong, the person usually has no idea.
None at all.
Their prefrontal cortex is completely blank. They aren't thinking about a sad memory, they were just relaxing on a table.
They don't know why they're crying, because their cognitive mind wasn't invited to the interaction.
Oh, wow.
The physical pressure of the massage pressed directly on an emotional scar embedded in the fascial matrix.
So the body is reacting without the brain's permission.
Exactly. The mechanoreceptors in the tissue send a signal back up the spinal cord, and the body begins discharging the stored kinetic energy of that old trauma. It completely bypasses the cognitive story.
Because the tissue is remembering exactly what the conscious mind was forced to forget during the initial triage.
It's a physiological flashback. The body is speaking its native language of sensation and release, while the intellect is just sitting on the sidelines, completely bewildered.
Now, while the fascia is this broad, continuous web covering the entire body, Yasminn narrows the focus down to one of the most notorious, specific storage sites in human anatomy.
The psoas muscle.
Let's talk about psoas. Located deep within the core of the body, it connects the lumbar spine directly to the femur, the thigh bone. It is the only muscle that connects the upper half of the body to the lower half.
It's a massive, crucial structure.
And according to the source material, it is incredibly documented as a primary site for trauma storage. But why this specific muscle?
Because the psoas is fundamentally our anatomical danger sensor.
Yeah.
Its biological function is directly, inextricably tied to the mammalian threat response.
How so?
Well, when we are in extreme danger or when we feel sudden terror, what is the universal human reflex?
The flinch. We curl inward into a fetal position to protect the soft underbelly and the vital organs.
Exactly. And the psoas is the primary engine of that movement. It is the massive hip flexor that aggressively pulls your knees up to your chest. It is the muscle that instantly contracts to brace you for impact.
So let's contextualize this physical contraction within the survival biology we were debating earlier. You face a severe threat. The psoas muscle fires immediately. It braces your core.
Right.
But the emotional weight of the event is too overwhelming, so the brain initiates triage and files away the terror.
And because the mind filed it away, instead of completing the biological stress cycle, the loop remains open.
The loop stays open.
Yeah, the external threat passes, the car crash ends, the predator leaves. But the psoas never receives the neurological all-clear signal from the brain.
Wow.
It never gets the instruction to stand down.
So it remains in a state of perpetual bracing. The tension becomes the new baseline. You could be walking around, going to the grocery store, sitting comfortably at your desk, but deep inside your pelvis, your psoas muscle is still braced for an impact that happened a decade ago.
It becomes a physical vault, a subterranean safe of frozen panic.
A safe of frozen panic. That is intense.
And this explains something profound about somatically focused physical practices, like certain forms of yoga or deep hip openers. Yasminn discusses how physically targeting and pulling on that chronically braced psoas muscle has the ability to unlock psychological material.
Because you can spend 10 years in talk therapy meticulously mapping out your childhood, but talk therapy cannot physically reach into the pelvis and stretch the psoas.
No, it can't.
When you engage in deep, sustained physical stretching of that specific muscle, you are manually prying open the vault.
You are sending a new mechanical signal to the nervous system that contradicts the stored trauma.
And what frequently comes rushing out are visceral memories or deep-seated emotional answers that the conscious mind couldn't access because they simply weren't stored in the intellect's jurisdiction.
We are talking about literally unlocking a physical archive.
Which forces us to look at the daily mechanisms we unknowingly use to ensure that vault stays closed. According to Yasminn, our primary defense mechanism isn't avoidance or denial, it's speed.
Speed is the ultimate modern defense. This leads us to one of the most transformative and, frankly, agonizing experiences Yasminn details in her exploration.
Oh, this part.
Is her encounter with the practice of uncomfortably slow movement.
This part of the source material was wild to me. She describes a somatic practice where she was instructed to move at a pace that was awkwardly, painfully slow. We are talking about taking over 40 minutes just to complete a basic everyday transition.
Like moving from a seated position to laying down.
Or from laying down to standing up.
70 minutes just to stand up. Just try to conceptualize the physical and mental friction of that.
I can't even.
And the remarkable part is, even when Yasminn thought she was moving as slowly as humanly possible, the facilitator continually prompted her to go slower.
Slower.
Every time she found what she thought was the absolute limit of her slowness, she was forced to have her speed again.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because my immediate reaction to hearing about a 40-minute stand-up exercise is pure, unadulterated anxiety. I would lose my mind.
Most people would.
But that anxiety is exactly the point. Yasminn analyzes this intense psychological friction and concludes that we move fast through our lives specifically to maintain the illusion of control.
Yes.
The constant rushing, the hyperproductivity, the endless multitasking, it is a highly sophisticated, culturally sanctioned evasion tactic.
It is a way of using kinetic energy to outrun the deep, unresolved somatic signals we refuse to feel. If you think about the actual physics of movement, momentum provides artificial stability.
It's exactly like riding a bicycle. If you are pedaling fast, it's incredibly easy to stay balanced. The forward momentum does the work of holding you upright.
You don't even have to think about it.
Right. You can coast over potholes, gravel, and cracks in the pavement and barely even register them. But what happens if you slow that bicycle down to an absolute crawl?
The artificial stability vanishes. You start to wobble violently.
You wobble, you have to actively fight to stay upright, and suddenly you feel every single bump, every subtle deviation in the road. The slowness removes the mask of momentum.
That is a perfect visualization of the psychological process. When Yasminn slowed her movements down to this agonizing 40-minute crawl, she completely stripped away her momentum.
There was nowhere to hide.
Exactly. There was no rush to the next moment, no task to hide behind, no future goal to occupy her intellect. Without the speed to defend it, the cognitive mind simply lost its grip.
She describes the experience of moving through the space like a cat. Time basically dilated, and the results of this extreme forced slowness were overwhelming.
Stripped of her momentum, she experienced massive waves of raw emotion rising up out of nowhere. Sudden surges of fear, intense compassion, profound love, and deep physical pain.
Because the slowness forced her body to finally surface the exact files the brain had locked away during past traumas.
The intellect was completely neutralized by the glacial pace, and the body finally had the silent, spacious environment it required to speak.
The emotional scars in the fascia and the tension in the psoas began unwinding simply because she stopped using speed to run away from them.
It requires a terrifying level of vulnerability to drop the armor of speed.
It really does.
Right.
But it leads us directly to the practical question of release. If the body is holding all of this historical data in the tissues, how do we actively let it go when the mind inevitably fails us during a hijack?
Which brings us back to the panic attack Yasminn experienced earlier in her narrative.
Right.
The hijack where her pristine intellectual map was totally useless. To survive the moment, she had to abandon cognitive analysis and rely entirely on alternative, somatic methods of release.
When the mind failed, she surrendered to the body's native language. The source material outlines 3 specific interventions she utilized: deep breath work, spontaneous somatic movement, literally shaking and dancing in the middle of a severe anxiety attack, and EFT tapping.
Now, to the highly rational modern mind, the idea of spontaneously dancing or shaking your limbs during a full-blown panic attack seems completely irrational.
Almost unhinged, frankly.
Right. But biologically, it is the most logical, scientifically sound action you can take.
Explain the biology of the shake. Why does convulsing or shaking the body work when rational thought fails?
Look at the animal kingdom. Imagine a gazelle being chased across the savanna by a cheetah. It narrowly escapes and finds a safe cluster of bushes.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
That gazelle does not sit down, cross its legs, and intellectually rationalize the near-death experience.
It doesn't journal about the cheetah.
No. What it does is stand there and physically tremble. It literally shakes its entire body violently for several minutes.
It is physically metabolizing the massive surge of survival chemicals that were generated for the sprint.
Exactly. The mechanical action of the shaking physically discharges the adrenaline and cortisol from the bloodstream and the fascial network. It sends a highly specific mechanosensory signal up the spine to the brainstem, communicating the threat has passed, the energy is spent, we survived.
It allows the nervous system to complete the stress cycle and return to a baseline state of calm.
Yes. Humans possess the exact same biological hardware, but we socially suppress the instinct to shake because it looks erratic or weird.
We hold the toxic energy inside our tissues purely to look socially acceptable. That is tragic.
It is. But Yasminn realized in the midst of her hijack that she had to let the physical form run free to discharge that emotional scar. She had to bypass the intellect entirely and speak directly to the nervous system through movement.
And she also mentions EFT tapping. For the listener who might think tapping sounds a bit woo-woo, what is the actual mechanism there?
The EFT, or emotional freedom techniques, involves tapping on specific acupressure points on the face and body. The underlying mechanism is mechanosensory stimulation.
Okay, so it's not magic, it's mechanical.
Right. By physically tapping these specific, highly innervated points, you are sending a piezoelectric signal, which is a small electrical charge generated by mechanical pressure, directly to the amygdala.
And the amygdala is the brain's fear center.
Exactly. This physical input has been shown to rapidly downregulate amygdala activation. You are essentially turning down the volume on the brain's alarm system through touch rather than thought.
So again, it is a physical input altering a neurological state, which bridges beautifully into another profound experience Yasminn shares regarding touch, but this time in the context of receiving positive energy.
Wow.
She dives into an experience she had with conscious, extremely slow touch within a tantric context.
And we should clarify here that tantric context in this scenario isn't necessarily about sexuality.
Right, it's about presence.
It is about hyper-present, non-goal-oriented, highly conscious interaction. It is touch that moves so slowly and respectfully that it entirely bypasses the amygdala's threat detection system.
Yasminn uses this experience to highlight a massive, heartbreaking difference between how the mind receives love and validation versus how the body receives it. She describes lying there, receiving this incredibly slow, intentional physical contact. And during this, a practitioner spoke a very simple phrase.
You deserve this.
You deserve this. Now, intellectually, Yasminn had heard those exact words 1,000 times. From therapists, from well-meaning friends, from her own daily affirmations.
Her prefrontal cortex thoroughly understood the concept of deserving love.
Right. But she notes that usually when she hears those words, they just hit the surface and slide right off. They don't stick.
They don't penetrate.
Let me play devil's advocate here. Why don't they stick? If I know in my brain that I'm a good person, why does a compliment feel hollow?
Because usually those words are being spoken to a contracted, structurally defended body.
Oh.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the somatic architecture, imagine your fascial web is thickened with old stress, your psoas is chronically braced for a threat, and your entire posture is subtly pulled inward in a defensive flinch.
You're wearing armor.
You are wearing armor. So when someone say you deserve this, the words literally hit a physiological wall. The intellect translates the vocabulary, but the nervous system rejects the premise entirely because the tissue itself does not feel safe.
It's cognitive dissonance at the cellular level. But in this tantric context, because of the impossibly slow conscious touch, her physical defenses were disarmed.
Her psoas was relaxed, her fascia was pliable, her body was completely open and felt entirely safe.
And she says that telling an open, undefended body those exact same words transformed them entirely. They didn't hit a wall. They penetrated deep into her nervous system and became profound, lasting medicine.
The physical openness was the prerequisite for the cognitive validation to actually land. It proves, quite beautifully, I think, that the human experience does not truly live in the narratives or the stories the mind creates.
The narrative is just the echo. The physical tissue is the actual intact site.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a crucial point of synthesis for this deep dive. Because after unpacking all of this biology, it would be very easy to misinterpret Yasminn's stance as a total rejection of traditional psychology or intellectual analysis.
Absolutely, and we must clarify that she is not discarding the intellect at all. Therapy, deep cognitive reflection, analyzing your behavioral patterns, making sense of your historical timeline. All of these intellectual tools remain absolutely essential. You still desperately need the map.
But her argument, supported by the survival biology we've discussed today, is that there is a foundational structural layer existing beneath language. A literal biological matrix that simply must be addressed on its own terms.
Because you cannot outthink a chemically altered fascial web, and you cannot reason with a braced psoas muscle.
You need the cognitive map to understand where you want to go, but you need the somatic release to actually clear the physical roadblocks on the path.
Precisely.
And this is exactly why this matters to you listening right now.
Yeah.
I want you to think about your own life for a second. Think about your own healing journey, your triggers, your chronic stressors. Have you hit a wall?
Are you exhausted?
Are you frustrated because you understand your own psychology perfectly, like you know all the whys, but in the heat of the moment, you still react the exact same way you did 10 years ago?
If you find yourself endlessly circling the same emotional drain, despite possessing all the intellectual insight in the world, it is highly probable that you are trying to solve a somatic, structural issue with a purely cognitive tool.
You are reading the swimming manual while actively drowning. Your body is holding the physical files of your past, and it is waiting for you to drop the armor of speed.
It is waiting for you to stop relying solely on your intellect.
To slow down to an uncomfortable crawl and to get curious enough to let the tissue speak.
It really requires a fundamental shift in how we approach healing. Moving away from merely talking about your trauma and moving towards safely feeling the physical sensation of it in the body.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. A little experiment for you to try on your own today. Next time you feel a sudden, unexplainable physical tension, maybe your chest tightens during a mundane meeting, or your jaw locks up while you're driving, and you are in a perfectly safe environment. Pause. Ask yourself, is this just random stress, or is my body remembering something my mind actively chose to forget?
And perhaps more importantly, what happens if, instead of immediately trying to think your way out of it or distract yourself with momentum, you just stand up and let it shake?
Just let the X-ray machine stay broken, step into the murky water, slow down, and just see what happens.